All right, hopefully pulling this all together now. This all was at least somewhat fun, or at least mildly amusing or somewhat interesting. So as a quick recap, I'm just going to go through our different learning objectives of our different modules and just make sure that we sort of hit on each of those little points as a quick little recap. So in Pavlovian conditioning, what was the process of Pavlovian conditioning? So hopefully you can, at this point, define the conditioned stimulus, conditioned reinforcer, the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned reinforcer. And the Pavlovian conditioning is typically through a pairing of an initially neutral stimulus, or what becomes a conditioned stimulus, with the unconditioned stimulus through some type of contingency or time-based pairing, which then generates a conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus. So, and traditional examples might be something like an eye blink reflex, right? Can be triggered by a light. And if there was a tone that comes right before the light turns on, you might have a conditioned response of when the tone occurs, then you might have a pupil constriction related to that. Hopefully you can define the unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and the conditioned response, and demonstrate an example of classical conditioning in your training program where you have associated some type of conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, perhaps an odor with some food or odor with a toy, and that has generated a conditioned response, perhaps salivation or staring or some type of other biological reflexive response to the presentation of that conditioned stimulus. Hopefully you can identify parameters associated with levels of classical conditioning and design a classical conditioning training program that optimizes your training approach. So things like delay conditioning versus simultaneous conditioning versus backwards conditioning. Identify some of the factors about the relevance of the overlap of the stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, as well as whether the conditioned stimulus is novel or whether it's something that is highly familiar in the environment, something that is related to how well Pavlovian conditioning is likely to occur, and evaluate your own training plans to identify optimal and suboptimal practices. So hopefully you've taken a deep dive into what it is that you do now that you know a little bit about all of these different topics and can sort of pinpoint a little bit in what are some of your practices and how does that relate to the optimal parameters for Pavlovian conditioning. Going into there, we talked about operant conditioning, right, which is about the ABCs of behavior: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. We defined our discriminative stimulus, which is a stimulus that indicates the availability of a reinforcer, or an S delta, which indicates the unavailability of the reinforcer. We talked about our operant behavior and how these are going to be sort of occasioned or emitted behaviors in comparison to our Pavlovian behaviors that have a reflexive relationship. We had our reinforcer, that is then our consequence, or C of our ABCs for consequence. And then we described hopefully canine detection in terms of an operant behavior chain, where we have a two-component chain where there are two operant units. And we talked about some of those Pavlovian components to it, where the odor itself, it becomes within a Pavlovian conditioning relationship to the presentation of the terminal reinforcer, so that you can get Pavlovian conditioning to the odor itself, as well as the odor itself becomes a conditioned reinforcer that maintains the search behavior of that first part of that chain. We then talked about different schedules of reinforcement, and hopefully you remember the 4 different schedules: the fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. We talked about continuous versus intermittent schedules of reinforcement, and rich versus lean, where rich schedules of reinforcement help build the momentum, and that those intermittent schedules of reinforcement can also help with building resistance to extinction by making sure that it is difficult to discriminate between contexts in which there is going to be, or context that is a reinforcement type of schedule versus when the context has changed to an extinction type of schedule. So that intermittent schedules of reinforcement make it more difficult to determine whether reinforcement has stopped or whether odor is going to be available for the search or whether it's not going to be available. But we also talked about how behavioral momentum and high rich schedules of reinforcement can help you persist through by having a long history of reinforcement and repetition for responding to that particular odor. And then hopefully you had fun arguing or justifying your approach to continuous or intermittent schedules of reinforcement and training. And remembering, going back to that behavior search training, that we can talk about your schedules of reinforcement of your terminal reinforcer, or within your behavior chain of your search behavior, the odor appearance being as a component within that behavior chain, reinforcing that search behavior sort of within that entire system. Then we moved on into generalization and stimulus control. Hopefully remember generalization gradients, generalization versus discrimination processes. We talked about generalization gradients, peak shift, the effects of overtraining and the narrowing of those generalization gradients. Then we talked about concentration as potential dimension for generalization gradients within our detection dogs. We also talked about concept formation, or basically multiple exemplar training, where we give multiple examples of different types of mixed odors for our fuel oxidizer mixtures. So the dogs respond to a wider variety of fuel oxidizer mixtures. We've talked about context in our schedules of reinforcement in terms of whether the dogs are able to identify what the schedule of reinforcement is in effect in our different contexts, like our training scenarios versus our operational scenarios, and whether there are relevant SDs in the environment. So for example, do you have your training equipment with you? Does the dog have their harness on? Things like that can all become discriminative stimuli for the context effect of is the dog searching. And then from there, we moved into impulsivity and attention. We talked about how do we define these terms? How can we sort of gather attention on the relevant components of our target that we're interested in by having multiple exemplars of our target that varies in non-relevant features. So for example, if we wanted the dog to pay attention to shape versus the color, we varied the color with the same shape. And then we also used our distractors by having multiple different backgrounds of the irrelevant dimension and the incorrect components to make sure that we were focusing attention of the dog specifically onto the one relevant dimension that we were interested in. Then we talked about impulsivity and self-control and how we can define self-control and impulsivity, particularly of inhibiting a response for a smaller immediate reinforcer versus a larger delayed reinforcer. We talked about the importance of how values of reinforcers sort of decline quite rapidly with time, meaning that it's very important to have a rapid reward delivery or quick access to it, because that'll help maintain higher values of that reward, as well as how attention and relevant discriminative stimuli can be manipulated and controlled, as we were talking about manipulating our backgrounds with our colors versus our shapes to make sure that attention is on the relevant feature that we're interested in, and using distractors again also to modify what the attention happens to be on. And then also ways that you can assess impulsivity in your dog if you're interested in it, and interest in potential future research and training for impulsivity and improving that. So with all of those topics, hopefully you had something of interest that caught your eye or was at least mildly amusing. Hopefully this wraps up this sequence. I know that I enjoyed doing some of it, but I also know that I'm exhausted, so I'm sure you are too. But if you have any questions, concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And I look forward to speaking with you and seeing your assignments.